Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guests and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Today's returning guests are Brian Stout and Amee Schmidt, who are here to talk about SDI and Chapter 3 of Stranger Things, Holly Jolly. Welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s. I'm joined once again by fellow strangers, Amee and Brian. So guys, why don't you go ahead and remind our listeners who you are?
Hi, folks. My name is Amee Schmidt, and I am a English professor here in Michigan, a superhero geek extraordinaire, and a huge fan of Stranger Things.
And I'm Brian. I'm a learning consultant by day and pop culture geek by the rest of my life. Little freelance writing.
So this week we're talking about Chapter 3 of the first season of Stranger Things, the episode Holly Jolly. And we're also talking about SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. So let's start with that. What is SDI? Why was it important? And what are some of its long-term effects?
Well, the SDI is a Strategic Defense Initiative. It's something that Ronald Reagan put forth as an idea to kind of give us the upper hand in the nuclear race with Russia. It was kind of coined Star Wars. The term was used, Star Wars, during the 80s, kind of interchangeably for obvious reasons.
You say for obvious reasons. What do you mean by that?
The aim was to put all sorts of stuff into space and name it at Russia, essentially.
Well, basically, because you're dealing with space lasers like the Death Star.
That makes Reagan Darth Vader, and I'm not sure I'm not upset about that at all.
So yeah,
what was, from my understanding, it was like a goal, right? The idea was they were going to try to find a way to strategically place a bunch of defensive lasers that could essentially disarm any foe's ballistic missiles, right? Mm-hmm. Lots and lots of controversy, and it was not successful and kind of disappeared in 93.
Never really worked.
It never really worked, right? Because there were lots of problems with the concept, right? So first of all, they didn't have the technology, and all of the experts said the technology just isn't possible. We've got decades before this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. More importantly, though, or more interesting to me, has been like the political / ethical reasons for creating it, right? Like when Reagan proposed it, it was a danger because we had this assurance, this mutual assured destruction, right? Mm-hmm. That was protecting us,
or
right?
MAD,
so we had,
as it was called,
right, MAD. So we have nuclear weapons everywhere. Everybody agrees that we can't set them off because everybody's just going to die. But the SDI made that a risk, right? Because now the United States Reagan in particular, was threatening to get an upper hand, which could potentially actually kickstart a nuclear war. So that was the argument for me. And that, I think, fuels a lot of paranoia, right? That comes from that particular element.
So yeah, the basic idea was it would give the U.S. an advantage in the arms race, that if the Soviet Union launched nuclear missiles against the US, SDI was a program of having lasers in space to shoot down the missiles. The idea was to give the US the advantage, which also created a sense of anxiety, let's say, around the world, especially on the part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it seemed, and I think as evidenced by some of the responses, some of the dialogue in this episode, it seemed to kind of put that awareness back into the minds of Americans too, which I think for quite a while there had just been sort of this, I don't know, essentially kind of a standoff, right? Like if we launch and they launch, then that's a wrap for everybody. So, you know, it sort of re-engaged this idea that, you know, we could be the ones with the upper hand, of course, because that's what Americans always feel like they have to do. But I think it's kind of interesting the way that the characters in this episode talk about it, because they talk about it, they reference it, but it's kind of dismissive in a lot of ways. They're sort of like jokey about it, because
where do they reference it in this episode?
There's an episode when Hopper and his partner's name escapes me, when they go to the site to go look around, they kind of like smooth talk their way into go looking around the testing site. That's one part where it comes up and they're talking about it. And because I think when they're getting the tour, if I remember correctly,
right,
you know, there's kind of an assumption that they're working on that. Like he asks a question about like, oh, is this related to, I don't know if he calls it Star Wars or not, or if he just
space lasers.
Yeah.
They don't mention Star Wars by name, but by the way, as you had mentioned,
probably is,
the program was referred to in the media as the Star Wars program, and I remember being a kid, I was a huge Star Wars fan anyway, and my parents were news junkies. So, you know, the morning news, the 6 o'clock evening news, the 11 o'clock news, it was always on. They were always watching it. And the world news at 6:30 almost every night would have some report about the Star Wars program for a few years there. And that was always on in the background when I was doing whatever I was doing as a kid. And so whenever I heard the word Star Wars on TV, my ears would perk up, because I would think, oh, hey, they're talking about Star Wars on the news. And I'm like, no, damn it. It's just that stupid Reagan thing again. So yeah, the idea of Star Wars at the time referring to this program there was a sense of derision behind it. It was kind of treated as a joke at the time. And so, yeah, in this episode, they don't reference it directly, but they do talk about the space lasers, right? And so
they're not allowed to use the term Star Wars, perhaps.
Perhaps, I don't know. We'll get back to that, because Star Wars does play into the show a little bit more. But yeah, when they come up to the gate of the Hawkins lab, Hopper's there with two of his officers. Powell and Callahan are the names, and Callahan is the younger officer, the white guy, who's the one who's referencing the space lasers. I wonder if this is where they build the space lasers. And when they get inside, and Dr. Brenner's name is dropped as being the head of the lab, Callahan's like, you see the guy who makes the space lasers? And the security chief who's giving them the tour is like, space lasers? And Hopper's like, yeah, ignore him.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was thinking about a lot of different things. One, I wondered if they picked Star Wars because of the name recognition. So
apparently Reagan was a big fan of Star Wars too, and so he liked that idea of calling it Star Wars.
Yeah, because I remember him saying it. I certainly can recall in my memory of him like using the term. And I think, you know, now, and just like you, when I was a kid, I kept hoping that, you know, George Lucas would come out or something and they'd start talking about what they're going to do. But it's, yeah, like now with my cynical middle-aged mind, I think like, oh, they probably wanted to do that because it's got a zippy name, and
absolutely,
me of, like, Space Force, you know, and like.
Speaking of Space Force, what are some of the long-term effects of this SDI, this failed program?
Well, it's, as Amy mentioned, I read that on the wiki that it got rebranded. I think it was around 92 or 93. They didn't really like stop per se, but they changed the name of it. And then it looked like one of the things that I wrote down was that Trump was kind of trying to get it going again, and that Mike Pompeo was interested in trying to reignite it. And I don't remember him ever using the term Star Wars, which seems like a real missed opportunity for somebody who loves all those buzzwords.
But he did introduce Space Force.
Yeah, he probably would much rather have something that was his own. That totally makes sense.
Right. And when I first heard the reference to Space Force in the news a few years ago, two things immediately came to mind. One of which was the Space Marines and Aliens, which we will talk about when we get to season 2. But also I had immediate flashback to SDI and the Star Wars program. And I'm like, holy shit, this failed defense program is coming back. How did that happen? And it kind of makes sense because, I mean, not to get too political, but so much of Trump's administration was an 80s throwback.
Yeah, it's
right.
They keep going to the Reagan playbook because of it's the last time they really had somebody who was real, like, had this mass appeal. It's
who was regarded again as one of those sort of Washington outsiders. That was part of his appeal.
Yeah, that making that connection totally makes it clear why Trump was pulling so heavily from the Reagan playbook.
But honestly, if it comes out that he was on coke the whole time, I would not be surprised at all. I'd be like, yeah, that checks out.
It was the 80s.
It was the 80s, exactly.
I knew I had read this, and so I was searching around to try to figure this out. Reagan was actually not particularly happy about the Star Wars moniker because that led to so much of the lack of credibility, and he tried to push against it. At least later on in the program, so like by 86, right? He was trying to get them to use the official name because of the credibility knack, right? Which I think maybe at first he was like, oh, hey, yeah, this is going to make it cool. And then realizing, oh, wait, that makes this seem science fiction-y. And they were really attempting to do something seen in science fiction. Yeah.
But of course, the problem with SDI, as I mentioned before we started recording, is that it sounds like an STD. So,
yeah, I wondered if I was going to get in trouble for Googling it at work. But.
Okay, so, and as you mentioned, Brian, that does lead into this particular episode because it is referenced directly in this particular episode. So let's talk about Chapter 3, Holly Jolly. First of all, what are your thoughts about this?
It might be my favorite episode in season 1, mostly because I love I'm a big sci-fi fan. I love the concept of the upside down. And this is where we start to see that conversation happening between Will and his mother. And she's setting up the Christmas lights along with the alphabet. Yeah, and that progression.
Ouija board.
Yeah, that progression of communication from the lamps to just putting up the lights to Will leading her down, that's masterful and from a plot perspective. As a writer, I look at that and think, oh, gee, that's cool.
And it shows how smart Joyce actually is. That's a really good idea on her part.
Very clever, yeah. Because she starts with the blink once for yes, 2 for no, right? Like this is how you communicate with a person who can't speak. And right now, this person is, she can't see him either, right? So she's got this one method of communication, and I think that's just fantastic. So
and the limits of that method is you're limited to yes or no responses, so you can't really communicate more fully.
Yeah, and her thought process. Yeah, her thought process, that critical thinking aspect, she does it fast, right? Yes. She goes from yes to no, thinking, how do I help you? How do I help you? And then we see her at the grocery store. She's buying all these lights and we think, oh, just crazy Joyce. But once we see her.
Just ring it up, Donald.
Right, just ring it up, Donald, right? And so,
and but then we see her at that time too.
Yeah, we see her doing this incredibly logical thing, setting up the alphabet in order to communicate with her son who's in the upside down. So much happening, from a writer's perspective. I'm just like, why am I not that smart?
And there's an interesting transition, I think, when we see her starting to paint the letters on the wall. There is a screen wipe to Karen, the Wheeler mother, who's using a spoon to stir something as she's preparing dinner for her family. So we get that contrast between Joyce and Karen set up here.
I also really like the way it was written. I think I mean, there's big stuff that happens in this one. You know, I hadn't
Yes.
seen it in quite a while, so I just watched it earlier today to get myself reacquainted. But this episode is packed with a lot of really interesting stuff that like big things happen that are big
Yeah.
moments, but also it sets some interesting it also, you know, has some breadcrumbs in it too. Like this
Yes.
is one of the first times that you really start to see the relationship with Mike and Elle kind of starting to bloom a little bit, and the other boys are annoyed by it, and you can, you know, that starts to become more and more clear. They're kind of frustrated and probably jealous to a
It is a
degree.
fairly pivotal episode, and from story structure, from that perspective, we're entering into the rising action or the complication phase
Yeah,
of the plot. So this is where things start to take off. We
yeah,
see
those,
Hopper becoming much more active in his pursuit of Will and in his pursuit of the truth.
and then of
What
course
else was
Barb,
there?
poor Barb.
Oh yes, Barb. What happens with Barb? Because that's how the episode opens. We hear the
Yeah.
song, and this actually makes me laugh a little bit. So we hear the Foreigner song, Waiting for a Girl Like You. And we have a contrast or a juxtaposition between Nancy and Barb in this opening moments of the episode. So, you know, Nancy and Steve are having sex, and then Barb is being murdered by the Demogorgon, and it's intercut between those two.
All to the tune of Waiting for a Girl Like You by Foreigner.
Like it feels like both Steve and the Demogorgon are singing the song, right? Like
Yeah,
to
totally.
the respective
wrote that
women
down.
in the scene.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what
Yeah.
kind of made me laugh, even though it is kind of horrific and gruesome, especially what's
Yeah.
happening with Barb. But there's the idea that the Demogorgon was waiting for a girl like you. But yeah, we do have that contrast, and let me ask you this: is it really a stark contrast between what's happening with Nancy and what's happening with Barb?
Visually, yes, right? So we have the dark side of Upside Down. It's incredibly dark, right? And so dark I had to turn on, like, close the windows in my house so that you can see what's happening in the scene. And then, you know, in the bedroom, they've got the lights on. You can see both of their faces. However, thematically, I don't think they're very different at all. Up to this point in the story, we very much see Steve as a predator, right?
Mhm.
Like Nancy is seriously this super innocent, unassuming kind of girl. She is a
Perfect girl,
virgin.
as Tommy and Carol refer to her.
Yeah. And she's a virgin, right? And we know that Steve has this sort of predatory a reputation, right? So in the scene, the juxtaposition is great because we have this real life sort of on the edge of being almost normal experience in the real world, and then this absolutely supernatural. But then if you start making comparisons, we have two predators after two young women.
Mm-hmm. So I like that juxtaposition of love or the situation of sexuality contrasted with this action of death. And it makes me think of the German concept of Liebestod, or the connection between love and death, or sexuality and death, and how there's a duality between those two things. And I see that idea of duality throughout this entire first season. There are so many comparisons or juxtapositions, I know I keep using that term, between different characters. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, Joyce versus Karen. And then we have what's happening with Barb and Nancy, Eleven and Will. There's a constant series of dualities or parallels between characters.
And Steve and Jonathan.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, totally.
We get that confrontation between the two of them.
Yeah, there's the confrontation where Steve breaks Jonathan's camera.
Very sort of aggressive action to Jonathan, who's not aggressive at all.
I felt so bad for him in that scene. But I also am still kind of wondering what's up with the picture taking, because it is kind of creepy.
That, yeah,
I
it is.
mean,
It is weird. We
I
mentioned
mean,
that
once
before.
they're showing like what it actually snapped the pictures of,
Uh-huh.
it's not as cut and dry in terms of like, oh, he doesn't do anything wrong. It's like, there's some pretty candid stuff he wound up taking pictures of,
And that's the
but I,
sense that I got from an artistic perspective. It is that it was a candid caption of these people who didn't know that they were being filmed. So you get a sense of what they really behave like when they think they're not being watched. So I think that's the idea, the artistic intent behind what Jonathan was doing, is taking that candid picture of them, showing them as they really are. But yeah, there is something.
I mean, I think the other thing too is the camera is really, I mean, it literally puts a barrier between him and them also. Yes. And it is kind of the lens through which he has to view it all, sort of at the outside looking in. So, I mean, it works on that level, but it is, it's a little, I can't remember if it gets explained or resolved or addressed at some point, but it's a little
yeah, there's some discomfort there.
Yeah. But on the other, but also, I mean, it's not unimaginable that somebody who's that age and kind of on the outside of everything would do something like that. Not to say that it's okay, but it seems very plausible.
Yeah, I would so my gut reaction in that scene is to want to defend Jonathan, right? Because he's the character who I relate to more than Steve. But then when you see that Jonathan has taken a picture of Nancy topless, then you go, well, dude, that's just a little step too far. And then I start to think, well, as far as a high school student trying to defend his girlfriend, all he did was break the guy's camera. Like, my perception of Steve in that scene actually changed too, because he holds back more than I think most 17, 18-year-old young men would do, seeing that some other young man took a picture of his girlfriend with her shirt off.
So what are we to think about Steve at this point? How do you feel about Steve?
At this point in the season, I am not a fan. I do see him as a predator. I think he's not the worst predator ever. I think maybe he's trying to do better. Like, he's like, the fact that Nancy's spending time with him makes me think either Nancy's very naive and easily manipulated, or there might just be a little something in Steve. But right now, I just don't like the guy.
He's very unlikable. And I think it's interesting that he becomes such a likable character later on in the series. I was surprised at that, because from the beginning of the show, I'm like, yeah, I don't like this guy.
Yeah, he's definitely set up. And I think, I mean, and obviously that, that's part of like being consistent with some of the tropes from the 80s, right? There's always this like jock or cool person is usually the villain. There's umpteen examples of that. So it is kind of cool the way they're sort of upending Steve and also Jonathan at the same time, because in broader strokes, Jonathan would just be this kind of like, person you'd always want to defend, and he wouldn't do anything wrong, and he's probably always just doing art and listening to better music than everybody else in town. And but it's interesting. I like the idea that they chose to shade that a little bit and do something a little more complicated with it, because so much of this show's appeal is, I don't want to say just a nostalgic grab, because it's not, but its popularity is certainly plays very heavily into people's,
and it draws very heavily on the tropes and themes of 80s pop culture, TV and movies, but it also subverts them a little bit. So I think we can understand why Nancy is with Steve. I mean, certainly he's the cool guy, right? He's the guy that's, every girl would want, right? Or at least in his mind. Why is Steve with Nancy though?
I think he's looking for redemption, but I don't know why. I mean, at this point in the season, in the series, we're really early, so I think what I see out of him is he's looking for a way out of this sort of bad, reputation. He's got a good reputation because he's in high school, but he may be maturing to the point that he realizes that that's not a good reputation, and he might be looking for redemption by being with her.
Okay. And we do see, I think, some hints or clues that he is not completely a douchebag. He's largely a douchebag, but not completely. Because there is a point where they're in the cafeteria and Nancy is asking them, have you seen Barb? What's going on with her? And Carol and Tommy, who are completely assholes, blow it off. But, Steve is like, well, hey, don't be asses here.
Yeah.
So like we do get hints of decency.
Friend says, like, who? And does it more than once to be so dismissive of Barb. And Steve shuts that down. So it is interesting that he's, you can see him starting to have a little bit of, or grow up a little bit. But from the jump, I just thought he was probably just trying to challenge himself, I guess, for lack of a, like, oh, I wonder if I could get this nerdy girl, or this girl that everybody says
that's
is good
kind
at
of the
tutus,
sense that
right?
I got. This is his next conquest, right?
Right. That's what I wanted to say. Yep. But it is interesting how he's little cracks of what we'll see later seem to be peeking through.
So has he been waiting for a girl like her? See what I did there? Okay.
Probably that is his only shot at trying to get a little better at become a person of substance. But
and I think it does reveal something in that she does kind of help him become a better person, or at least in our perception helps to redeem him.
Well, I say absolutely, as we progress through this season in particular, and then as we move further, definitely he changes leaps and bounds, right? Like he progresses as a character quite well. Yeah.
Yes. And certainly by the time we get to the second season, he becomes one of my favorite characters, which I never expected, especially the relationship between Steve and Dustin. I love that that connection.
Do you think that reminds you a little bit of how Brand starts out in the Goonies? Like how he's kind of
okay.
It just popped into my head because it seems like they have it's a much shorter duration, obviously, right. But like he seems to. He's kind of like there seems like there's some parallels there now. The more I think about it, like,
and
he was
Brand,
just trying to get the cool girl and.
He is, but Brand is a little bit more lower class than Steve is. And there is, in the Goonies, there is that upper class guy that Kara Green's character is dating, who is much more Steve-like. Yeah.
I make tons of comparisons between this and Breakfast Club. Just every single character fits. Renee, like one of those. So yeah, Emilio Estevez's character really is the Steve, and you even see, and I can't think of his name, but our bad guy, our bad boy in Breakfast Club is a lot like
Judd
Jonathan
Nelson.
in the way that he presents.
Bender.
Yeah, there we go. But yeah, so I think that those tropes, right? Like just those are well seen and actually a little turned on their heads. They're really recognizable in Stranger Things, but I do think that they, the writers have played with them in a way that, in the way that Steve progresses, I think is above and beyond a lot of the things that we've seen in sort of the redemption of the bad guy character.
Yes, and I think that's something which is deliberate on the part of the producers of Stranger Things here, is they are taking sort of character archetypes of 80s cinema, especially John Hughes, and that we're meant to see Steve as that, upper class, rich jock douchebag that we see so frequently in those movies, but they do subvert it a little bit, especially going forward. They do this with several other characters later on as the series goes on, because like when they introduce, I can't think of the character's name, Paul Reiser in the second season. We are immediately set up to think of him as being a villain or a bad guy based on our knowledge of him in the work that he did in the 80s, especially in Aliens. But then they play around with that a little bit, and they do that so frequently. Take our perceptions or our expectations about these characters and then twist them a little bit.
You know, that's interesting because that also is he's kind of did the reverse with Matthew Modine.
Right.
You mention it.
Yes.
Matthew Modine was always the good guy in the movies that he was in. He was always the heroic character, at least in the 80s.
Very much so. And he is so creepy here. And supposedly, I don't know if this is true. I would have to look it up. But Matthew Modine was interviewed about his character of Dr. Brenner here. And he was asked why he made him so creepy. And apparently Matthew Modine was surprised by this because he thought he was being very sympathetic and very fatherly. But yes.
I feel sorry for his children if he has any.
Right.
It's me being loving.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you do kind of see that a little bit in this episode in the way that, he does interact with 11. He does, stroke her face and stuff like that. He does hold her and carry her, but it's in a really creepy way.
Yeah, it's more of a possessive way than a fatherly way, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, look at my creation doing what I want it to do.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's at least how I see that interaction.
Totally.
Yes.
I
Takes
absolutely
pride
agree.
in her when she's killing his employees.
Yeah, it's interesting that that is the point where after which she has done those things, that's the point at which he seems to have kind of softened toward her as he sees that she's doing what he was hoping she was capable of.
Right.
I love how much of the backstory, how much development we get, the flashbacks that we get for 11 in this episode. We learn so much about what she was willing or forced to do and what she rejected doing. Like that particular scene where she refuses to kill a cat.
Yeah.
But then instead kills one or possibly two. We don't know for sure if the first one's dead, but at least he makes a dent in a wall, so we think he's dead.
Yeah. Oh, he is massively hurt, man.
Right. And so we get a sense of her true power, which we didn't know for sure until that point, right? We'd seen her do a couple of things, but then we get this flashback where she snaps a man's neck by twitching hers, right? It's a real move forward and what we want to expect or begin to expect from her character.
It also sets up that she really wants to be in control of those things herself, because there's the part where Dustin is trying to get her to on command lift the Millennium Falcon, and then there's a scene short later on in the episode right before those flashbacks where she just has it up in the air and she is suspending it
on her own terms.
And so it's
and let me just say, I really want that toy.
Oh, right.
What's that?
No, who doesn't
really
want a toy? Yes. A toy Millennium Falcon.
Yeah. I mean, back in the day, I didn't have one of those. I had a model of the Millennium Falcon, but I really wanted that larger play set. And,
it was my major gift that year for the holidays. I had that thing.
Dude.
It was amazing.
Okay. I bet. Some recurring themes that we see in this episode. We learn about Dustin's knowledge of snacks, which comes back a few times. So as they're getting together and preparing to go out searching for Will, the boys are, Lucas comes in with binoculars from Nam, with a combat knife also from Nam, a slingshot, and a camouflage bandana. Very much approaching it from the Rambo perspective. And then we get, here's Dustin's idea of supplies, a bunch of snacks, right?
I love that kid.
Yes.
That character is one of the best. I mean, he is of course comic relief in so many ways, but he's very, very dynamic too. We talked last time about how much he fits that beast of the X-Men role, right? Where he is this incredibly intelligent person, but has this lovable sort of cuddly, other part to his person. And yeah, his knowledge of snacks, it's just so much fun.
And
To
it's
see
actually
him.
pretty practical, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to
Oh
need
yeah,
energy.
that was my first thought. I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's, they're dismissive of him, but
Mhm.
it's like, look, you gotta have, you gotta have some fuel if you're gonna do something like this. I mean,
Exactly.
it totally made sense to me. And then it also made me think, I feel like that's also something I remember. Like, I feel like I can see several scenes from movies from the 80s where there's like the kid that brings the snacks and everybody's like, oh, come
Kind of
on,
reminds you of
brought
Chunk
that.
in Goonies.
Yeah, I thought about Chunk for a sec too,
Yeah.
but and then I was trying to remember what I feel like that maybe even fits with the dynamic that he had with his mom too. I was trying to think of like that first scene in the first episode when you see his
Mhm.
mom. I feel like there's this dynamic of like that sort of practical, like, be prepared, or kind of not like a fear, not stranger danger
Right.
kind of scary, creepy stuff, but just kind of like, make sure you got what you need, like when you're going out the door.
Right.
Like the kind of mom that'd be like, don't forget to take your jacket, or
Exactly.
kind of
And we
parent I'm
do
being
see references in later episodes to Dustin knowing his snacks really well, right? Especially in season 2 when we get to his discourse on nougat. Right.
Yes.
We do get a reference to the X-Men here. The boys are at school looking for rocks to use in the slingshot, and they start talking about 11. And do you think her powers are natural like the X-Men, or were they given to her like Green Lantern? Green Lantern will be referred to later on, I want to say in the 3rd season, because we learned that Max reads Green Lantern comics. And then we get a reference to the Emerald City. So this is when Hopper and his officers are coming up to the lab, and I can't remember which one says it, but they refer to the lab as being the Emerald City. What do you make of that?
I mean, the most obvious thing that comes to mind is that there's a wizard in there somewhere, right?
Mhm.
That is controlling things, sort of this secret power that takes us a little bit back to the SDI situation. Like, there's something happening that's important and mysterious, and also very powerful, but we don't fully understand it.
And I mean, it is kind of literally an Emerald City in the sense that there is a portal to another world in this place. But of course, the officers don't know that.
I had not put that together yet. I like that, actually. That's really neat.
Mhm.
So yeah, we get, and for listeners who don't know, Emerald City is a reference to the Wizard of Oz. That's where the wizard is, where Dorothy has to go to meet the wizard.
And literally, it's like the anti Emerald City almost. You know what I mean? Like almost the polar opposite, because when you go into that portal, you're not in the land of Oz where
Right.
everything is colorful and there, things are wonderful. It's really horrible down there, but it is in the same way, like fantastical, right? It's got the fantastic motion to it. And I think we talked about this. I'm not sure if you and I talked about this or if this was in a previous episode where, we've made comparisons to this and Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, right? That this is that portal, right, from here to the fantasy world. Yeah.
Yes, and it is through that portal in the lab that Joyce and Hopper are able to retrieve Will. So they do have to go through that portal. There's also another kind of portal in the drain pipe through which 11 escaped from the lab. And that is what brings Hopper and his officers to the lab in the first place, is they find the outlet of the drain pipe and they know that it leads into beyond the fence to the lab. So that's why they're investigating this, because they think perhaps Will went that way.
Right. So here's one more reference. You ready for this? I'm rereading the Chronicles of Narnia with my 7-year-old niece, and I'm reading The Magician's Nephew, and the pond is the portal. Right.
Yes.
So they go head first into the pond and they portal. They have lots of different portals in the forbidden or the forest. So one more layer there of this sort of, this concept of portaling to another dimension, another world. I like that.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So that's drain pipe is sort of a rabbit hole. And I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole myself, and I'm probably reading way too much into this. I kept kind of flashing back to Charlie Day's character in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he gets, mired into conspiracy theories. Okay, so the officers don't know that there's a portal to this other dimension there. So why do they refer to it as the Emerald City? They view it as a strange place.
I just thought it was, I just went immediately to the wizard piece, that there's probably one person who's behind the scenes controlling it all.
And I think that's what we're meant to take from that. But it just seemed kind of weird if you think about it. Here's another thing. The lab is supposedly operated by the Department of Energy, and yet the guard at the gate is a military police officer, an employee of the Department of Defense. And this is where I'm going down the rabbit hole, where I'm probably reading way too much.
Oh, absolutely. This is fun, right? But this is smoke and mirrors, right? It's not funded by the Department of Energy. It is very clearly a defense project. But they are putting on is
defense oriented.
Yeah, they're putting a mask on it, right? So that it doesn't raise so much suspicion among the citizens of Hawkins.
Yeah. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Hopper, we reasonably are able to think that he was probably in the military, based on his age, based on his economic background. He was probably in Vietnam, and that is confirmed in the second season. So he would recognize a military police officer as associated with the Department of Defense, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Now, honestly, I don't know how government work operates. I don't know if the DOD, if military police do guard government facilities that are not part of the DOD. I wouldn't think so, but I think that is a clue, or should be perceived as a clue, that there's something off about this place. Like I said, this is my rabbit hole conspiracy thinking.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think that it seems like a really obvious way to trigger the viewer if you're paying close enough attention, just like you were.
And here's another thing. Callahan does reference the space lasers here, SDI, which was a DOD project, not DOE. So why would he think that the Hawkins lab, if it's a Department of Energy, why would they be working on the space lasers? And even when Hopper asks the security chief, what do you do here? Probably something to do with beating the Russians, right? DOE, would they be involved in that? I mean, certainly they would be, their purview would be like atomic energy. So there would be a connection there. But otherwise, yeah, space lasers, no, that's Department of Defense. So anyway, there's something happening here that's just, it's not adding up for me.
Well, and I know to explain this away is not exactly what we want, but it could have something to do with audience, right? This show is very much targeted to a contemporary audience who may or may not know about SDI, about the functions of the 1980s,
yes,
which might be the layers of what's happening in the scene might be particularly focused at audience, like to bring these questions and say, okay, why are all of these things happening? What do I need to know that I don't understand? Yeah.
Now we do get some more references and foreshadowing in the background and in some of the props as we go on. Specifically, when Nancy returns to school, she's talking with Steve at her locker. There's a book in her locker, which is Descent from Xanadu by Harold Robbins. Do either of you know this book?
I know Xanadu. I know Kubla Khan, right? That I know, but I've not heard of Descent from Xanadu. I have just Googled it.
Yeah, I had to Google it myself. I'd never heard of it. One problem is that it was published in 1984, and this particular season is set in 1983, so it's a little anachronistic. But all I could find about the book is there's basically the book cover blurb and then some reviews calling it trash. The blurb says, Judd Crane is ruthless, sexually irresistible, the wealthiest man in the world, and determined to conquer man's last frontier, eternal life. He pursues his dream on a dangerous, obsessive journey from Yugoslavia to China, from his lush island to a secret atomic city in the Brazilian jungle. Crane is willing to spend billions, risk death, outwit foreign agents, lose his entire empire and the woman he loves, until at the moment of victory, he discovers the most important secret of all.
Himself, hopefully. Right.
I don't know.
Journey of
Based on
self-discovery.
this blurb, though, I kind of want to read the book now, especially since it's reviewed as being so trashy.
And
Well,
you
Harold
can
Rollins,
read a preview online. I found it. And I'm going to read the preview just to find out what the heck is going on.
Right. I'll probably do that myself.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, that author is like his reputation is around making like really tawdry, like dime store page turner novels.
Right.
Right. I'm pretty sure I'm thinking of the same person.
It seems to be.
Yeah.
Looking up online his reputation, he does have that, being a very sort of popular trashy fiction kind of writer, but also being probably the best-selling author in U.S. history.
Oh my, are you serious about that?
Apparently, yeah. Sold more books than anyone else, including J.K. Rowling.
Well, now I have to read it.
Yes.
Wow.
Like, so when I saw that you for the listeners at home, Vince gives us a little cheat sheet outline of what we want to talk about today. And when I saw Descent from Xanadu, I had to look it up and thought, okay, obviously this has something to do with Xanadu and Kubla Khan. Mm-hmm. And so I instantly started making connections, right, to Kubla Khan. Right. You know, obviously I see that those connections very clearly. Now I'm wondering what it is that, what's this guy's name again? What Harold Robbins has done to create the parallel to Kubla Khan, because Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan is classic fiction, that we teach in a lot of intro literature courses. Yep. And the concept of the expectations of the grandeur of something being met with the exact opposite of what we expect, even, horror is really, really obviously happening in Stranger Things. So I like that's happening there.
For the listeners, Xanadu is a reference. The name comes from the Coleridge poem, Kubla Khan. It is the summer palace of Kubla Khan. That poem begins, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. So it is a place that's associated with like paradise or some idyllic kind of lifestyle. So my question is, how does this relate to Stranger Things? Because as we've seen, stuff like that in the background is always thematically relevant. I don't know if we can say always, but is usually thematically relevant.
I mean, like I was saying, I think so Xanadu is Hawkins, right? Like what we expect to be this sort of pristine, archetypal, suburban Midwestern town where everything's nice and fine and safe. But when we get deeper into it, we find out that it's not what we thought, right? So there's this underworld, specifically the Upside Down, that turns out to be and there's more
is the curtain.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So for me that reference was it hit me kind of over the head like a big.
That's the only connection that I could draw, really. I mean, unless the character in the book, this wealthy playboy, is supposed to represent Steve. Yeah, without having read the other book, Descent from Xanadu, I have no idea what this book is about. So I can't make a connection there.
Here's what I just found, because I'm reading about Harold Robbins. That makes so much sense. Harold Robbins was essentially like a real life Gatsby, according to this article I'm reading right now. Like he was this playboy and he was the handsome, cool person who threw all the wild parties. There's a quote here that says, Stephen King said, "I don't want to finish up like Harold Robbins. That would be my nightmare."
I love that.
So that's kind of funny when you think about it, because it seems like it sort of casts an interesting, we were talking about Steve and Nancy earlier. You know, I mean, I don't know, the idea that she might be reading this book and then drawn to somebody like Steve is kind of,
and that's the thing.
You know,
the book is
like a
in
little-
her locker, and when we
Yeah.
see it, it's between the two of them as they're standing in front of her locker. So I think we're meant to associate it with her. And
parallels
so, yeah, the
between-
only sort of
yeah.
connection I can make is to the title. Descent from Xanadu implies a sort of fall from grace or a loss of that sort of paradise, which we kind of see with Nancy, in that she has these sort of illusions about life and they're being dispelled. And then she
Well,
goes to her
even
English-
on a more
yeah.
base level, she's returning home to find her mom waiting for her at the door after she just lost her virginity.
That's true. And she does, immediately before we see the book, she does talk about how she feels like everyone's looking at her and staring at her. And then she goes to her English class, and we get 3 references here. On the board is written Cymbeline, being a reference to the Shakespeare play. Parable of the Laborers, being a story from the New Testament. And then there is a poster of Poe with the phrase nevermore, which is right next to Nancy's desk when she sits down. I can understand the Poe reference. The other two kind of throw me off.
I don't know either story. Cymbeline, I'm completely unfamiliar with. I have not read it, so I don't know what it's about. And then the Parable of the Laborers, I probably knew once upon a time, but I don't remember.
I had to look that one up too, because it's not one of the parables I was familiar with. But what's with the Poe, first of all?
For me, obviously, Poe is the master of death and horror, right?
Yeah.
And so much of what's happening here is death and horror, right? We have darkness, we have mystery, and everything that Poe ever wrote sort of matches the tone of Stranger Things immensely.
And that poster does say nevermore, which is a reference to The Raven, which is a poem about grief, and the speaker in the poem sort of grieving for his lost love, Lenore. And it's, you know, in that particular scene that Nancy really becomes aware that Barb is missing. So I think that's the connection there. Cymbeline. So here's the thing. I love Shakespeare. In fact, I got my master's degree in Renaissance literature with a focus on Shakespeare. I've read all the plays multiple times. I've seen them multiple times. Cymbeline, no matter how many times I see it or read it, I can never remember anything about it because it's super boring. It is the least of Shakespeare's works for me. The only things that I remember about Cymbeline is there is a fairly well-known funeral song, Fear No More, the Heat of the Sun, which I only remember because there's a line like chimney sweepers come to dust, which was used as the title of a story from the G.I. Joe comic book, which I loved when I was a kid. So that's the only reason why I remember that poem. And then there's the part about the dude in the box in that play that stands out because it's just such a weird image. But the main plot is you have this young couple, Posthumus and Imogen, who are, Imogen is a princess, Posthumus is an aristocrat or a nobleman, and they secretly marry. But then there is this other guy, Giacomo, who makes a bet that he can break them up by tricking Posthumus into thinking that Imogen has been unfaithful to him. And he does this by hiding in a box in her bedroom or bedchamber. And then when she's sleeping, he sneaks out of the box and basically spies on her as she's sleeping, steals a bracelet from her, and then makes some observations about her nude body, which he then relates to Posthumus. in order to break them up. That's the main plot of the play. There is a subplot about a war between Celtic Britain and the Roman Empire, because Cymbeline is a Celtic king, the father of Imogen. He has two sons which were abducted as children, who are then revealed later on. They come back safe and sound and basically put an end to the war. It's a super boring play.
So just based on, my super fast read of the wiki and what you've just explained, I see a loose connection between maybe the Jonathan and Steve and their vying for Nancy, and that Giacomo and Posthumus and they're vying for Imogen. It's very loose, but then again, that's about the only connection I find.
That, and then that was where I was thinking too, Amy. That, and especially as you described like the spying and stuff, that sort of reminded me of the camera. And
that's the only connection I could draw there, which is a bit of a stretch, but I think it does fit. And of course, the idea that the princes who had been abducted as children and who are returned safe and sound later on. So there's a connection between them and Will. But kind of a stretch. It's an obscure reference there.
It is. Yeah, I mean, I'm quite a Shakespeare fan myself. As a matter of fact, I bought some of your Shakespeare books recently, and I was like, wait, that's a Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
So that was one that I wasn't. It definitely wasn't something that was.
Yeah.
Well, it seems odd. It seems like it was on purpose because it is such an obscure reference. It would not have normally been taught in high school English classes.
Certainly not.
They would be learning Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet, or
especially at that time, because
exactly.
The Zeffirelli Romeo and Juliet was the big thing, and a lot of high schools were really jumped on board that because it was popular with teenagers.
Yes,
so they would have been doing Romeo and Juliet.
So there's no question that it's there for a reason, and it without having read it, I can't make any stronger connections than that. But I do think that there's something there. I'm seeing an image of Imogen being discovered in the cave of Belarius. Does she get kidnapped?
She has to go into hiding because Posthumus wants to have her killed.
Okay. I mean, could we also make that comparison between Imogen and Barbara?
Or 11, because Imogen does have to disguise herself as a boy.
Oh, there you go. Hey, so there's a little bit more that could be happening there. Yeah, it is really. I love that you have studied this show enough to find more than what we find, because then it prompts all these discussions that make me go.
Right. And, like I said before, I did teach this as a university course, so I kind of had to watch the episodes very closely, looking for these things.
I similarly taught The Walking Dead, just a few episodes from the first two seasons. So I have watched and rewatched every piece of those, you
examine every frame as closely as you can.
Yeah, and you watch it over and over again. So,
And then there's the parable of the laborers, which, like I said, I had to look this one up because it's not one of the parables that I knew. Apparently, it's about describing the kingdom of heaven. And the story is there is a lord who hires laborers and promises to pay them the same amount of money, no matter when they get hired throughout the day. So he goes out and hires laborers at different points during the day, and he gives them all the same amount of money despite how much they end up working. And the argument is that is a representation of the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't matter when you come to God and get into heaven, you get the same reward as someone who has been there all along.
Where was that? For some reason, I can't remember where that is in the show. Can you remind me of the context of when it?
It's on the board of the English classroom when Nancy goes into the classroom and notices that Barb's seat is empty. It's very much a blink and you miss it kind of thing.
Yeah, the Poe jumped out at me immediately.
The Poe was the obvious one. Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I can only make two connections, and these are real stretches. But the idea of the kingdom of heaven, relating that back to Xanadu, which was immediately preceding that scene. Perhaps it's a reference to Steve, who is coming into the storyline kind of late and becoming one of our heroes later on in the game.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It could be kind of a foreshadow of Steve's evolution.
Steve joins the party and becomes one of the good guys. Very later on in the story. That's the only connection that I can make, and it's very much a stretch.
Well, okay, so no, if you take that connection, it could be like a thematic rule that they're setting up early for us, because we have more characters who join in the 11th hour. We have Max and her brother, whose name I forget.
Billy.
And then so Max and Billy definitely being one of those characters that doesn't redeem himself until the very, very end, you know? And then, Max sort of comes in as, later in the story, but there's a whole, a real parallel there when Max comes in between, like, her being just as valuable as 11, even though she came later. Yep. So this idea that no matter how late you join the group of X-Men, you are still an X-Men, right? Like, you still get to belong. So that, I think I can see that happening. And it really is, it sets up a rule, right? Like, the rule of this story is, as long as you join the team, as long as you fight for good, you will be accepted.
That's true. I can see that happening, because that does happen, like you mentioned, multiple times in later seasons with newer characters coming in. And then that takes us into the music of this episode. There were two songs which are featured. Foreigner's Waiting for a Girl Like You opens the episode, and then the episode closes with Heroes. And we've already talked about the Foreigner. So let's talk about Heroes. And this is the Peter Gabriel cover of the Bowie song.
Well, now that we've been talking about the laborers, that also really kind of ties into the song Heroes in some ways. Like, it's, the line almost everyone remembers is that, we could be heroes if only for one day, right? So
that's a good point.
Yeah. And I was just mentioning earlier that I think it's a tie between this and Hallelujah is the most needle dropped song of all time at this point, right?
Pretty close.
Yeah, it's and also like multiple versions of it too. So it's interesting. I was trying to wrap my head around why Peter Gabriel here. My first thought was just that he had a very big 80s, a little bit later than this. This is a stretch, but it made me think about, when did Shock the Monkey come out? Because there's some of those things that made me think of L and, like, just experimentation and stuff.
Right. That would have been like 85, 86, I want to say.
I feel like Shock the Monkey's earlier 80s, like it would have already.
It could be. It is one of his earlier hits.
Because So came out, somebody would have to keep me honest here, but I think So came out in like 85 or 86.
But Heroes itself. So what is the song about?
It's really, so the song is most predominantly seen or played at the end scene when they pull Will's body out of the water.
Yes.
And we're looking at our heroes, right? Our group of four. And this is a sad song, right?
Yes.
Like, it's sort of like a pitiful hope, right? Like, the song, go ahead.
The way that Peter Gabriel has recorded and arranged it, it's very sad. Yes.
Well, the lyrics are sad, because the lyrics are things like, I drink all the time. Maybe although nothing's going to keep us together, this is a lost cause, but we're going to try to do something right now to sort of be heroes just for one day, to make something of ourselves at this one moment.
I see where you're going with this. Okay. Right.
So, even though the four of them have reached the end of the line, right? Like, they have been trying to be heroes for like a week in the time span of the show, right? And here they are getting to this end, right? Like they have reached the helplessness.
And they've spent the day wanting to be heroes and find Will. We can be heroes just for one day. I think that's the message or the connection that we're supposed to draw from that. The song itself is also kind of I don't know if we can say it's an anthem, but it's definitely a Cold War oriented song. Because it's about a couple who are sort of defying the Cold War, a couple from the two sides of Germany, which for listeners who don't know, at the time, Germany was divided right down the middle by the Berlin Wall into East and West. One side was democratic and free. The other side was part of the Soviet Union. And so the song is about a couple from both sides of the Cold War coming together and defying the wall and the soldiers.
There's a particular set of lines that I'd like to read that really resonate for me in it. So the speaker in the song is saying, I can remember standing by the wall, and you're getting an echo from the other speaker. And the gun shot above our heads, and we kissed as though nothing could fall. And the shame was on the other side. Oh, we can beat them forever and ever. Then we could be heroes just for one day. So it is. It's really, there's a sense of extreme desperation. And the sense of the other side really echoes the Upside Down in a lot of ways.
That's a good point. I didn't make that connection. Again, that sense of duality that we keep seeing represented in this season.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking a lot about that because I just did a scan of the lyrics too. But, it does seem like one of those songs where we just take that one little piece out of it. I mean, how many times have you heard just those two lines in a movie trailer because they put some triumphant sound music behind it? It's and it's
so it is very easy to take it out of context and get a different meaning.
Yeah, same with Hallelujah. It gets used about a million different ways in every different show. But there's no less than at least 15 different versions of Heroes. I just looked. There's like at least 15 different recordings. Anybody from like Oasis, Blondie, TV on the Radio, Nico, Moby. Yeah, but it's a very enduring song. And it's interesting because, this just made me think of Born in the USA, one of the other most twisted songs
most understood songs of the time.
Another song that typically, like, out of context, just gets used for a certain feeling and not its overall meaning.
And then you have the Stings,
Every Breath You Take.
There you go. Thank you. Another song that people use as their wedding song, which is it's actually a creepy, scary song.
And it's very much played that way in the second season because that's becomes one of the featured songs of the second season. But I mean, there are two ways you can listen to that song. It's either something which is very romantic or very, very creepy.
It's just all creepy. And as Brian mentioned, Hallelujah, Leonard Cohen wrote that song, and it's a sad song. It's a song about violence and torture, and people pretend, like pick and choose out of context to make it a celebratory song. I don't think that Stranger Things did that, right? I don't think that they took this and said, "Oh, we can be heroes." It's actually it's giving us, and that might be why they chose the Peter Gabriel version, right?
Because I'm sure that the arrangement is part of that because they chose one of the more downcast arrangements.
There is a bittersweet aspect to it in that they're thinking they're going to be heroes by saving Will, but they don't. Or do they? ...
Do they ... Right. We've established that we are okay with spoilers in here, right? So after having seen the whole show, I watched through season 3 and I've rewatched season 1 twice now, and I've rewatched this particular episode 4 times now in preparation for our conversation. But when you see, I want to know if they use the actor to pull out of the water or if they use a double, because it really looks like him coming out.
I don't know. That's a good question. Because yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it's revealed to be a dummy, but it is so realistic and so lifelike that I wonder if it is the actual actor that they used on film.
Yeah, that's I was pretty sure it was the actor, but that's a good point.
Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Anything to add? Any other points you want to discuss?
There's one that you're going to start talking about next week that occurred to me in this episode, though. There's a part when the neighbor brings over the casserole to Joyce and the daughter is upstairs looking around. There's a total nod to Poltergeist.
Yes.
And when the shot is set up, and she's looking at the wall instead of the television.
Very much Poltergeist.
Yeah.
Little hints of E.T., a little hint of Close Encounters, but yeah, definitely Poltergeist. And
certainly Close Encounters also. Yeah.
That brings us to the homework for today. Next time we're going to talk about Poltergeist, which if you haven't seen it, what's wrong with you? You have to see it. We're going to be talking about that. And the special topic is going to be Reaganomics. So what was that? Why was it important? And what are the sort of long-term effects of it? Any last words?
I love Stranger Things, and I love this podcast.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, it was super fun to get to pick these things apart and put all those pieces together. It does kind of feel, I mentioned Charlie Day earlier. I do sort of feel like I'm doing bird law.
Exactly.
Here. It's a lot of fun.
Exactly. Okay, then. Thanks for joining us again. Until next time, stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.